The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
The subject of death and dying can be a very difficult conversation to have. Many of us avoid having the conversation because it makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to worry or upset our loved ones, and we really don't want to face tough questions or think about our own death. Having open conversations about death and dying allows us to prepare ourselves and our loved ones on how we would like to create our own end-of-life journey. On every episode of Guided Crossings, we will explore a different part of the dying process and offer suggestions on how to prepare your loved ones as well as yourself. I'm your host, Andrea Sebastian, and this is Guided Crossings. Hello and welcome to Guided Crossings. Grief is a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion for people, regardless of whether their sadness stems from the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they love has received. On today's episode, we will be exploring grief. I am pleased to welcome Deb Pelletier, who recently retired from a career in grief and bereavement. Deb, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So I have interviewed a few people now on Guided Crossings, and one of the things that I find is a common thread, that when I ask them about how they got involved in a certain area of this work, like hospice or having a conversation or things like that, it's always from a life experience. How did you get involved with it?
Well, I didn't get drawn into bereavement because of a loss, although many of the volunteers who work with us come through that way. I was a social worker, and so I was working for an agency that had a hospice component. And after doing that for a number of years, the position for bereavement coordinator opened up, and I moved into that. And I have to say, a little bit reluctantly, thinking it would be very depressing all the time. And I've learned rather quickly that it was quite rewarding.
Oh, nice.
And never looked back.
Good.
Yeah.
No, I know I did a end-of-life doula certification, and I remember telling my kids like I was going to be doing that, and my son was, make sure you watch a lot of puppy videos, Mom, because he just thought, how can you even go down that road? But I don't think people understand, which, brings us to today's topic of grief, because it's a very complicated conversation to have because it comes at you from all different angles, and everyone's grief is different, right?
Right.
So everybody thinks of grief like with a loss, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a death loss. It can be a divorce. It can be an end of a job. How are the grief feelings different?
I think obviously having grief related to the loss of someone through death is the most profound. And certainly those other losses that you referenced, there is a grief process, but the most profound is when an individual is lost to you. And I think most of the time, it's not something you can really prepare for, not fully.
Okay.
And I think that people are really taken back from their process when they're going through grief after death. They're not expecting it to be as overwhelming as it can be.
Well, let's talk about that. What are some of the symptoms, if you can call them that, or some of the feelings people might all of a sudden be experiencing and not understanding that that's grief?
Yeah, I think that, well, there's certainly symptoms such as, insomnia or loss of appetite or even physical ailments or symptoms that people are not connecting with their grief.
Like what?
You can have headaches, you can have a lot of upset stomach. There's even something called broken heart syndrome, where people think they're having a heart attack and they evidence a lot of symptoms of that, and in fact, it's their grief. So memory loss, inability to concentrate, inability to finish a sentence and recall what you've read, which is quite frightening to people. And I think a big part of what is helpful to people going through grief is to normalize that and to help them to understand it's a temporary state, because it's very unnerving to experience those things and then think, I'm getting sick too, or I'm becoming demented. And in fact, it's the profound impact of the grief.
Okay. How do people move through grief?
Differently. Although it's a universal experience, everyone moves through it at their own pace, on their own timeline. There is no set map per se. And what I say to people is this is going to take longer than you anticipated or are really necessarily comfortable with, because this is a process that takes time.
And I think that's what people want, because they don't
absolutely.
understand that they're feeling that way. And then you sort of let them know that, well, this is grief. And you're like, okay, when's it ending?
Yeah. They want it to be over. The intensity of the pain and all, and the adjustment, they obviously don't want to feel this intensely. But it's important that they be cautioned gently that this is something you have to take your time with, and that you will get there, but you can't rush yourself through it. And so that they can kind of step back and recognize the need for self-care, the need for support, and to not beat themselves up because they're not back performing on task and adjusted fully and not having tearful outbursts. People can be hard on themselves.
Well, I was going to say, I think I've been in situations where I've heard people going like, I don't feel that, and it's almost like, well, there's no guidebook to go through, like I don't feel guilty, or worse, my last conversation, I didn't say I love you, and I have all this guilt, and they, like you said, they beat themselves up, and what are some ways they can figure out how to cope with that?
Well, I think again, the more that someone in grief can understand a framework, can put words to it, and to have, as I said before, their emotions normalized, their behaviors normalized, because they'll maybe even be doing some things that they don't want to share because they think, oh, people think I'm crazy. I slept with the shirt of my loved one, or I haven't been able to part with things. So the most helpful thing, and you see people kind of feel this relief when you're able to help them normalize and appreciate that this is not a permanent state, but it is grief. And none of it's crazy or abnormal. You're okay. You just have to learn how to tolerate some of this and be patient like you're recovering.
Right. It's really hard to watch someone who's dealing with grief.
Yeah.
And I think like it's two sides, because you don't really know what you should say, because you don't want to say the wrong thing. And then the person who's grieving may not be comfortable if you said the wrong thing to then publicly or, grieve in front of you.
Yeah.
What are some things that can be done between two people that can help both sides? Because watching someone going through grief, you really want to do all you can.
Yeah.
But we don't know what we're going to do. And then if you're on the side of being grief-stricken, you're like, I don't know if I can tell this person that because they're going to, I might upset them or, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the presence and listening is the best thing that someone can do for somebody in grief. To give them the sense that they're not afraid of the emotion. They're not, they're open to understanding the experience rather than trying to fix it or giving the impression of they're rushing, throwing tissues and, you'll feel better. Just to let that individual know, I'm here for you. Let me know if you'd like to talk. And just giving them your physical presence and your ability to listen to them express, it's really meaningful. That's why bringing people together who are grieving is so powerful, because they know everybody else there is tolerant and understanding of their circumstance.
So does it make a difference, for instance, if, say, you're talking about a group situation and everyone has experienced a loss? So if they've lost, say, a mother versus a grandmother or a husband, is the grief different?
Well, everyone's grief is different depending upon the nature of the relationship.
Okay.
So yes, they'll go through it differently. They'll feel it in different ways. But there's a universal piece to it where everyone can understand and really be empathic to, I know what it's like to lose anyone near and dear. And so I get that. But ideally, if people can be with someone who's had the same loss, the same relationship, it bonds them even in a stronger way.
Okay. Is there one part of grief harder than another? And like, what are some of the, I mean, you touched a little bit on, things, but how come sometimes people, I think, get maybe stuck in one part of it versus they get through maybe that part quicker, which I hate to use that term because there's no timeline like you've said, but there's certain, I don't know, maybe the guilt or something, I don't know.
I think what happens again is that in our society, we focus on feeling better quickly and fixing things. So I think what becomes really difficult for people and can make their grief more challenging is, as a little bit of time goes by, their natural supports pull back, and the griever thinks they themselves should be doing better, when actually they might be feeling worse because the numbness has worn off and the reality's filtered in a little bit more, the permanency piece, and they're feeling worse, and the support that was there isn't there like it had been. So that can be really tough for folks. So, they're questioning how they're doing, they're thinking they're supposed to be better, they're feeling more emotional, not less, and they feel a little more isolated.
Okay. The other thing that I always think is family dynamics.
Sure.
So how, I'm fortunate to have a sister and a brother. So when my mother passed away, I had good sibling support and we were able to be supportive for my father, right? But I find that sometimes the parent doesn't necessarily recognize the kids are suffering and vice versa, or you take it out like, my mom's sisters that were still alive and things like they've lost a sister. How do you collectively all deal with the grief and not feel like, oh, my grief isn't important right now because I've got to look after this person, or, like a pecking order of whose grief's more important at this time?
And that is a real common challenge in families because the whole dynamics get shaken up. And everyone's had a different relationship with the person that's died. And roles are all kind of in flux. So again, I think it's keeping your expectations reasonable, that maybe right now this sister isn't going to be the one that can support you. Or maybe, just saying, I'm not able right now to be there for this person, or they can't be there for me, and it's okay. Or they might not yet feel some of what I'm feeling. But just helping the family members recognize it and respect it, and also look for support maybe outside of the family unit with close friends or someone else who's been through the loss of that relationship. Because you're all going to go through it differently.
Right. One of the things, too, that I know, I've been in work situations where someone's lost a significant, life partner, and they go back, they get a whole 1 week off to deal with it all, and then they have to come back to the office. And how do you, coworkers in that, are there any things that coworkers can do to make the person feel that we understand you're grieving and if you need this or you need that, or ways to support.
Yeah, and again, that's a little bit unique too because of the individual, what they're going to want. Some people want to go back and they don't want to get emotional, so they don't want anybody at work to approach them. Other people feel offended by that if no one approaches them. And I think the ideal thing is if a coworker, if someone can reach out ahead of time before that individual comes back and say, tell us what's going to work for you. What are you going to need from us? Because we're here and we're willing, but we want to know, how to respond to you. Because you're going to get a different answer from every individual.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I lost a brother-in-law, he was very young, and it was just a little bit before Christmas. And I remember going to the grocery store and being really angry with everybody because no one knew what I was going through. But I was like, why don't you know what I'm going through? And then, I'd go another time and I'm like, well, they don't have any idea. So how can they be supported for because it was almost like a pity party. And then I was like, well, you don't do that. It's worse for this person or it's worse for that person. And it was just like so conflicting for me to kind of figure that all out and still kind of try to celebrate. Or someone would say Merry Christmas and be like, yeah, Merry Christmas, but it's hard because no one knows.
Your whole world's changed and no one, it's been impacted and no one can relate to it on that level. So again, I think just if somebody can reach out to the person in grief and say, tell me what would work for you. And if that changes, I'm the point person, come and let us know because we want to honor what's going to support you best. And I've heard vastly different answers. But I think not having it mentioned at all, as if never occurred, that can feel like they're being dismissed. So, but the when and the where and the how is what the person in grief can cue you.
Right. When a family's all grieving differently, because say, someone in the family's just been given a terminal illness. So that person can maybe go into a grief, obviously, right away because they're terminal. So, but yet the grief of the person after that person has passed comes in. How does that get all sorted out, sort of like, how do you help that? Because you want to be supportive for the person who actually got the terminal illness diagnosis, and they're going to be going through a lot, but yet it's affecting you as well.
Yeah, and I think again, within family systems, you're going to be in different places. It's recognizing that. It's making sure that the patient as well as the caregiver are getting their needs met and recognizing that there can be some conversation. Sometimes a social worker, particularly in hospice, can help facilitate that conversation. And as you point out, it is often the patient who's ahead of everyone else. The patient, because they're feeling physically the changes, and they not all the time, but frequently they can be ahead of being more accepting of what's coming than the loved ones who don't want to let go. So, helping there be some open, honest conversation where each, even saying, I wish you weren't going to die, and the person who's ill saying, I'm feeling ready, or this is where I'm at. Just having some open dialogue can really help just understand where each other's at. But you're not pushing one or the other to be in a different space. But it is tricky.
Yeah, I remember when I was going through my doula training, it was really cute. This little old man came running to the doula and was like, whatever you do, don't tell her she's dying, And then, because she has no idea. And then, she'd go in to see the little, elderly lady, and she was like, don't tell him I'm dying.
I know.
And it's like, guys, I mean, there's no right way, again, but it might just really make the other person feel better if you do communicate what you're feeling at that time.
And that's a lot of where hospice intervention can be helpful because either a chaplain or a social worker, and sometimes even the nurse or an aide, can help gently facilitate that conversation and cue the other in that, they do know. And it's almost, a relief because we're not trying to hold on to a secret or tiptoe around a really stressful topic. It's the elephant in the room and we're talking about it, and it kind of eases a lot of that.
A lot of times too, you hear, the word self-care.
Yeah.
And that's great, but what are some really good self-care things you could be doing to take care of yourself, or even for the person who's got the diagnosis or is grieving?
For grievers, and many of them may have been in a caregiving role or may just be nurturers by nature, it's really helping them to give themselves permission to lower their expectations of themselves. It's saying to them, this isn't going to be, you don't have to step back permanently, but ask for help, accept help. Don't look at that as a weakness. And I say to people, if you were in a physical accident and were physically injured, and those injuries were obvious, and you were in some ways incapacitated, you would have to allow people to care for you, and you would.
Right.
But this isn't something one can see. And so it's helping people appreciate, but you're recovering. You've been wounded, you're hurting, you're healing. So let people in. Ask someone to cook a meal for you. Ask someone to drive your children to the sporting event. Don't feel like you have to continue to be on to the level you've always been. You'll get there, but right now you're recovering. Sleep is important. Making sure that people consider how they're eating, making sure they're hydrated, really helping them appreciate you've got to focus on these things for yourself, and it's okay. Because if you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be able to ever attend to others. But it's a concept that really you have to keep reassuring people.
Well, I think you're just so overwhelmed, and you're almost on like autopilot, so you just keep pushing and doing what you think you have to do, and it's like, something else was, you don't say to someone, I'm here if you need me.
No.
That's too open-ended,
Right.
just it kind of, well, I offered and they didn't take me up on it, but it's like, no, offer to do something. I will bring you dinner every Wednesday, or I will get your dry cleaning, or whatever, I'll come cut your grass. It's very specific tasks that then allows the person who's grieving to just grieve.
That's ideal if you know there are things they can use, and then you're able to be very specific, or to say, I'm going to call you every week and check in. And, say, well, what about do you need this? What about do you need that? Because you hear, if you ever need anything, and people won't. They won't. And frankly, they don't even know what they need.
Right.
That changes hourly. So they're not able to say, oh yeah, let me think about, can you do that? They don't know. So making suggestions, as you say, or just doing without being too imposing is wonderful. And people will be very appreciative.
I think another thing that I find very interesting is when I know someone is going through something, I always feel like I can't bring it up.
Right.
But then when someone will talk to me about a loved one I've lost, I love it. So I always work that through, that, I could bring up this person's loved one and they'll be happy to tell me something about, it's okay to say their name, that sort of thing. And I think that, I don't know, for myself personally, sometimes I have to really actually work that through in my head, that I could say this person's name. It's going to be okay.
You're not causing the pain. They're already grieving.
See, that's a good way of putting it.
That's the fear. And then if there's tears, see, I did that to them.
Oh, okay.
They were really okay until as if they weren't thinking about it.
That's just it, right? I think of these people in my life all the time, and so
right. But again, it's, as you cited earlier, it's feeling like you're in two different worlds, and everyone outside of that wants things to be normal, and they want you to be okay. So now I don't want to bring up the most painful thing, because then, see, I brought them right back to it.
Right.
And that that, as you say, people want their loved one remembered.
Yes.
They want them to have made a difference. So they want those opportunities.
Right.
But people are afraid of grief.
Right. Yeah. What are some misconceptions about grief?
Well, I think that it's over quickly, that it's linear, that we go through one feeling and then that's over, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, and there's a timeline. When it's up and down and up and down, and you're going to feel different things at different times, and people aren't prepared for that. They want a roadmap. They think that one emotion, and some people don't ever feel certain emotions. For some people, there is no anger, there is no guilt. For others, there might be a lot of that. There's no right or wrong way, and there's no set series of steps that go in a linear way that one must follow. But you have to find outlets, whatever those are like.
So, like, for instance, I lost my brother-in-law very young, and then when his kids had, like, their weddings and their first their first kids and stuff like that, I had an overwhelming sadness that he was not going to be around to experience this.
Yep.
So does that, like, grief always kind of lingers then, or is that a different feeling or emotion?
Well, you re-grieve.
Okay.
And you'll have grief bursts if this person was significantly important to you, ongoing. But the intensity and the chronicity of that feeling is not going to be constantly with you as it is in those early times. But an event will trigger, and you'll have what's referred to as a grief burst, or there'll be that momentary reminder of how much you miss them, but it doesn't last. It's not as intense as it was when it occurred or shortly after. It doesn't just stop. You don't stop loving
Well, and I
somebody.
think that's what another misconception is. It's like, when am I not going to have
When am I
this
going to be over
feeling?
it?
Yeah.
When's it over?
Right. And people will tell you you're not over it, and you're like, wait, whoa, So that brings me to things like, we're almost out of time, but we can quickly go over some what to say, what not to say.
I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't.
Right.
No, tell me how I can be helpful. Tell me how you're doing. I'm here to listen. You can call me anytime. Is it okay if I check in with you? That's what people want to hear, not you'll meet someone else.
Oh, yeah.
You can have another child. Those things just, and again, you have to give grace because people are struggling, but they really just need to be present and give the message, I'm here to listen. I'm here to listen. I'll keep checking in. And just bear witness.
Okay. Are there any resources that people can look up for extra help with
There's
grief?
so much now online that you can Google up, and there are live webinars, and there are podcasts, and there are groups in the area, and there's so much more to read too that could reassure people about what's healthy and normal.
Okay. Well, Deb, we are out of time, but thank you so much for this information. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That's all the time we have for Guided Crossings. We'll see you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.